Hey everybody, how are you? It is Marina and Kevin from the Herbalism Show. We're super excited to see you today. We almost matched on the blue, but I needed to go a little bit brighter, and I'll try better next time for sure, Marina. But today we're not going to go into blue, but we are going to go into legal details. I know that can be a little bit heavy as a conversation, but why it's important to you to be able to listen is if you're going to practice, if you're going to know your scope, if you're going to know what the next steps are, you need to understand the legal scope and what you actually are doing for your patients and can do. So we'll jump right into it just in a sec. All right, Marina. I know the legal aspects for some folks can be a little laborious, to say the least, but I think they're a really important topic, and I'm so glad you brought them up today.
Yeah, I think for us to have confidence to practice and competence as well, we do need to know the legal status and how to navigate that system as much as we need to know about the clinical side of things.
Makes a ton of sense. And when you're first starting, like going in, I mean, obviously being a pharmacist by training, you have to take a knowledge exam. One thing for the audience that aren't pharmacists, I know lots of you probably are or in that space and know, but a knowledge exam and a law exam, usually related to your individual state that you're practicing in. When you're doing so, I'm guessing you did not look at any legal components around herbalism. So when in your journey of getting your herbalism training, did you start to look at that and be able to jump into it? And then what did you look at first?
Yeah, absolutely. So going through pharmacy school, right, I felt confident because there's all of these regulations and there are answers for everything. And yeah, you have to do the law exam every time you change your state or add on a different state. There's another law exam. So you know the federal law, you know your own regulations in your state, you know who to ask for any clarity. Board of Pharmacy regulates everything. So you get really comfortable also with somebody else granting you that license, right? And then renewing it so that an authority figure that is government regulated is also regulating your clinical profession. And that gives us like this confidence, I think, that somebody else signed off on my skills. I'm good enough in my competency, and now I can tell all of these patients of mine per the guidelines, and it's very, very clear, step by step, it's just very nice, right? And logical.
Yep. Yep.
And then when you go into uncharted territory of looking to get another profession under your belt or another degree, then it starts all over. So when I tried to sort of diversify out of pharmacy, I first started with health coaching, then I did functional nutrition, then I started learning about functional medicine, and then I went to herbalism at the end of all of that. So each one of these nuances, I had to ask myself the question of like, how would this help me? Can I combine it with pharmacy? Like, is this giving me additional scope? What's the difference, and how to go about it? So every time you learn something new, you have to figure out how does it integrate with your career or life and how to make it all work together. And then when I started actually practicing herbalism and seeing clients, the first time I probably was looking at the legal status of things is before even enrolling in these programs, but especially when starting to see clients. And so in herb school, this was definitely one of the topics, much like in pharmacy school, about, what are the regulations around herbalism, and one of the considerations for me even going and getting that, additional training and certification.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I was just pulling up for us, trying to in the background, but obviously it's in the foreground. When you're looking at that in herb school, is that resource I just pulled up? I just pulled up the American Herbalist Guild and their kind of breakdown. Is that a go-to spot, Marina? Because me thinking about from my perspective, if I'm thinking I'm going to incorporate herbs into my general practice, if I am an outpatient pharmacist, if I'm a clinical pharmacist in an ambulatory setting, if I'm a hospital pharmacist, you and I will have a whole nother conversation, I guess, on that here really soon. But with that being said, if I'm going to try to use something in the ambulatory setting, usually I'm thinking I'm going to look at my state regs based on what over the counter, remedies can be utilized that are not FDA regulated, they're under food regulations, and see where those parameters kind of lie and see what the scope is within my licensure. I know that there are some mentions of like needing additional nutrition licenses for pharmacists. I haven't seen that in any of the states that I've looked at for practice, in general, but please educate me if you have, Marina. But that's where I would go. I wouldn't have known to check out the American Herbalist Guild. What are your thoughts there on where should we be looking and where's kind of the truth?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first place you want to look is the government regulations. And if something is already regulated, then you have to follow those government standards and guidelines. And it does vary state by state in the United States, at least. So you have to go into, for example, if you want to talk about nutrition, you go to the nutritional registered dietitian guidelines and you see, do they allow other people outside of that scope in each state to talk about nutrition. And for the most part, pharmacists do have that in their counseling scope to touch on diet and lifestyle, but we focus on the drugs and specifically on the safety and interactions. So same thing with herbs. Within our scope, we're supposed to look for interactions from a safety perspective, right? Or any possible contraindications. So it's sort of our inherent scope, but sort of not, because we don't look for the efficacy and the benefits. We just look mostly for the safety and, kind of safeguarding people away from what may harm them. So same thing with that. So from a health coaching and dietary and nutrition standpoint, we have to look to those regulations that regulate registered dietitians and certified nutritionists, and whether they allow other professions outside of that to talk about food and guide people in their food choices. And so that is its own, regulation. So if you are going to talk about food as part of your practice, you have to make sure you're in a state that allows you to talk about it, or you get that additional certification, actually a degree and a license, the RD or the CCN.
Oh, that's super helpful. And Reed, thanks so much. We really appreciate it. Marina's amazing. So all the words that come out of her mouth are gold.
Yeah. And everybody else who's tuning in, let us know what questions or confusion you have around any sort of regulation or licensing requirements in herbalism or other integrative modalities. And I'd be happy to touch on that.
Oh, definitely. So that being said, when we look over, then we've already covered, here's the state rules and regs. Here's where you're typically seeing nutrition-based regulations happening. And sometimes it's incorporated into the pharmacy. So for example, they could be under a code or under a regulation set in your individual like state bylaws. But the question for me then goes to, after you've looked at that and everything is copacetic, what other elements do you feel like need to be governed or thought about as an individual pharmacist when now you're practicing herbalism in your individual settings? The reason I ask that is, looking at the American Herbalist Guild, the initial kind of set is exactly what you and I have just talked about, of scope of practice, what can you do, how can you do it depending on your practitioner license. But then the second set, Marina, is all related to product. How are products regulated? How do you find safe products? How do you determine, the safety, efficacy, et cetera, of those products? You want to go into some other aspects or just those two, Marina, in any other depth so that folks have a better understanding of what they're talking about there?
Yeah, and we've touched on the second one a little bit in past episodes, but I'm happy to loop around. So let's finish with the first one. Herbalism as an entity is not regulated at all. So there are no government regulations around it. And therefore, the best, course of action is to really look to, like you mentioned, the authority is the American Herbalist Guild. It's sort of that professional, ethical committee and community where the profession regulates itself, essentially. So we want to have a high level and a high standard of both education and, ethical and clinical data and practice and guidelines. And without the government oversight, we need to do that for ourselves. So American Herbalist Guild is what does that for the United States, and there's other local chapters. And in other countries, there are also other sort of similar guilds where herbalism is not regulated in that country. And then in some countries, it is regulated, right? It's like Germany and other European countries. So there are specific regulations and guidelines around that. And then sometimes there's specific regulations around the products, but not the profession of herbalism. So sometimes it's either or both. And in America, in the United States specifically, neither is really regulated by the government.
Yeah, and it's funny, like seeing the way that the American Herbalist Guild puts it together. They really do plug in exactly what we've done in previous episodes. They go through product and manufacturing related questions, and then go through DSHEA, which is Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act of '94. So they break that down, like what that means. And then they go through the good manufacturing processes, which if you guys look back in our previous episodes, we go through the good manufacturing processes, how you identify those exact herbs, how if you're making your own herbs, how you go through those processes. And so take a peek at those. Any other pieces, Marina, that you feel like for the pharmacy profession in general, we really need to consider when it comes to the legal aspects and the scope of practice when we're first starting out with doing something with herbalism?
Yes. So depending on the setting that you would like to practice in, there might be a question of, can I fully integrate it with my pharmacy setting and my pharmacy license and my pharmacy hat, so to speak? Or does it make sense for me to completely separate these two professions? Because according to our current regulations, they are separate, even
Yep.
though, like I mentioned, historically, it shares the same roots. And like we talk about the Deshea and all this stuff. So it seems like it's very relevant to pharmacy. Out of all the other fields, herbalism and pharmacy are the most closely related, in my opinion and in my research.
Yep.
So if they share the same background, but there was this separation, like we talked about,
Yep.
it just, to me, makes sense to reintegrate them. But according to the current guidelines, it might actually make sense to keep them as completely separate entities, and to be a pharmacist, for your pharmacy related activity, and to be an herbalist for your herbalism related activities. And so there's that part of it. And on the most conservative legal side, that is actually my guidance for people that are getting into it.
That's super helpful because, thinking about the way that it's kind of regulated and looked at, if we're saying we cannot treat, diagnose, and what's the third one, Marina? Treat, diagnose, and
Prevent illness.
prevent illness. If we can't do any of those as an herbalist, legally, then if we're kind of separating those entirely, now we're just giving recommendations on, this food tastes good or this works, well for me, right? And so now we're just able to move into that space where we're selling a tea or an individual product and not giving any other like attributes to it that would now legally mandate that to be reviewed and identified as a product that has a medical, identity to it. And so there's an element that's really interesting because we are putting out drugs, right? We're putting out products that have medicinal qualities to them, but we don't have a stamp, from the FDA saying these have been approved, et cetera. So I love the conservative route. The one perspective that I'll bring in is it's been very difficult in rural communities, especially depending on the cultures that are in the area, when they're often taking an herbal remedy to be able to help treat disease, but then they're admitted into your facility. There's where the difficulty hits. And there's where the also like the penetrating difference is between what is legal and what is allowed. So even though it may be legal for these individuals to consume these things and utilize them for these given purposes, being allowed inside of the facility is different because your facility rules, regulations, policies, and procedures may say, if we cannot validate this individual agent has a stamp of approval from X, Y, and Z, and we have the original bottle or container, or we don't carry it in our formulary, then we cannot use it within our facility or recommend it or keep it inside of the person's individual medical records. So those individuals working in hospitals, clinics, some retail pharmacy settings, that's another piece to be able to look at is the policies and procedures for those individual settings. But anyway, Marina, with that being said, if that is the most conservative step, what we just kind of identified, and there's the limiting step, which I just kind of talked about a little bit, as you're progressing and as you're trying to pushing the profession kind of forward as you are, what are the next steps that you need to take to make sure you're keeping yourself safe, your patients safe, and everything under kind of legal binds?
Yeah, so I think it is very important to get educated. I mean, that it always starts with education. And I often just say that's the first step, because if you don't know what you don't know, then, you'll just blanket statement no to everything, right? You'll say there's not enough information. So it really takes the extra step of us learning about it before we can determine where it belongs, right? Does it belong in the formulary? Does it belong with the patient? Does it belong in the hospital? Does it belong in a pharmacy? So the pharmacy has often, historically and even now, been a place where a whole bunch of random stuff can be found in the pharmacy, right? In a pharmacy setting, like in a retail, I mean, right?
Yep.
Up until recently, cigarettes were sold, right? In a lot of chains, which is completely opposite of what a pharmacy should carry. Even though, again, tobacco comes from a sacred plant, but not all the other carcinogens and toxins that they created to put inside cigarettes.
Yes.
And the poisons. And then there was like a bunch of chemicals that like cleaners and all of this other stuff that potentially is toxic too, that's sold in pharmacies and other convenience stores. And then there's convenience stores that have Advil and other over the counters as sort of like first aid stuff. So what I'm trying to say is, yeah, it matters what you do as an individual pharmacist or practitioner versus what your setting is allowed to do. So those are kind of the two different topics. And then also the topic of individual or practice versus the actual product. So all of these factors, get factored in when I'm consulting with somebody and we're trying to navigate how can we legally and safely protect both you and the practice. And there are answers, and we have to look at each state and each situation a little bit differently. And again, if there's a way to completely separate it and that works, then that's fine. And if there's a way to combine it, say you have a retail pharmacy and you want to carry these natural products, there's nothing, restricting you from doing so. But if you get educated, you can actually carry products that you have trust and faith in, and you've done the work to check that company out, right? Whether using things like Consumer Lab or using experienced herbalists. And the other thing is, we talked about this before too, we need that integration between the professions too. So what if there was an herbalist, whether or not they're also a pharmacist or another provider, on staff in different places, then they would have more of that background and education to guide and advise on these things, or somebody from the local rural community that the people trust, and look to for herbs or other sort of spiritual healing, and integrating that in various settings, so that even if they're not all in the setting, we have these relationships and networks linking us together as a community for different ways to heal and support healing.
It makes so much sense. And I love that you basically say, put on your different hats. Like that's the way to keep yourself like down the correct legal road. Like you have your pharmacist hat that is doing X, Y, and Z things, really sticking to all the state guideline elements, and then practicing almost westernized allopathic medicine is the way to keep yourself and your license safe. That other hat you can put on, which I love that you kind of framed it this way and put the overarching title of nutritionist or dietary elements, is if you have the ability inside of your state to have that scope of practice, herbs can be looked at as a food, and we can look at nutrient depletion. We can look at how these help with individual disease states, and utilize our license to think of foods, just like herbalism, I guess, in an equal sense. They're really equating to health, for those individual patients. But you've got your pharmacist hat over here, you've got your nutritionist / dietitian hat over here, and I think that makes so much sense.
Yeah, and the biggest distinction, like you mentioned, that AHG has as the tagline when we look at the regulations, is that we're, as herbalists, not prescribing, diagnosing, or preventing illness, because we're not granted that sort of license. But even as pharmacists, we can't do that, right? So we don't have provider status. And until very recently, we weren't allowed to prescribe anything at all. Now that's changing, and we have some prescriptive rights for very limited things, or like therapeutic interchange kind of things. And so maybe all of this is going to start to change and shift, but I'm just sharing like this is the most conservative route for the way things are right now.
Smart. No, I love that in general, and I love the fact that pharmacists can use their knowledge and skill set to recommend OTCs. They can recommend things you can pick up at the farmer's market. We can recommend things that are going to be beneficial for overall patient's health. And I think there's a really nice way to be able to separate the two on what you're doing and how you're working it, because the conversations you're having in the OTC aisles are different than the conversations you're having at the counter. Exact same thing is happening when you're counseling a patient on their medication regimen that's happening, and you're then counseling someone on their nutrition and diet plan, kind of going forward. It's wonderful to hear this information. Thank you so much, Marina, for all the insights. As always, if anybody needs spaces to look, check out your state regulations first, as Marina was mentioning, and then you can go over to the American Herbalist Guild and see some of the details that they've kind of laid out in a really nice fashion. So there's everything for me. The only last plugs for us is we've got a really fun event coming up, Marina. And Marina coined it, which I totally thank her for. The RPH Ally Soiree is coming up here in July 18th through the 20th. Incredible speakers and minds throughout the country, just like this one right here, are going to be there talking about their individual specialties and really the future of pharmacy and what we're trying to do as a profession. So I'm really excited to see folks there. Any other words or parting words for us, Marina?
Yeah, we'll drop the link to the soiree, and we really hope to see you there. There's limited tickets, so definitely get yours today. We have an early bird special going on until the holidays next week, so grab it. We're going to have intimate breakout rooms and very, very fun things happening, as well as education, as always, because that is what we value. And then head over to the Herbalism channel in RPH Ally for more information on herbalism or any other questions that you have from this show. And really tune in next week, because we're going to be also talking about how the payment models also have to do with all of this. So like cost effectiveness and what we can do to really help move and value that patient, right? And the health above all. And how does the payment model all factor into this?
Boom. All right, guys, you have a wonderful rest of the day. Marina, thank you as always, and we'll talk soon. Have a great rest of the day, everybody.